This is a very individualistic society. People want to do what they want to do. They don't want to be told what to do.
Is it a civic duty to vote that would be somehow corrupted if people sold their votes to other people?
I don't think the concept of civic duty, I don't think that resonates with American values.
There's a lot of debate these days about the role of money in political campaigns. I'd like to put to you a question, see what you think. This is a novel use of money, a cash incentive, to get people to vote. There was a ballot measure, a referendum on whether casinos should be permitted in the state of Washington. And the sponsors of the casinos, those who favored the casinos, offered voters a deal that if the measure passed, then everyone who voted in that election would be paid proceeds from the casinos. 10% of the take would be distributed among everyone who voted, regardless of how they voted. Couldn't tell, it was a secret ballot. What do you think about this novel use of money to give people an incentive to vote? How many think it's okay, and how many find it objectionable? How many object? And the three of you don't. Why, Emily?
Voting is a civic duty. It's your duty to take part in your country or your state's government. And by voting, you have your voice heard, whether or not you get paid for it. So by paying somebody to vote, you're not really cheapening it. It just is something that you shouldn't have to be paid for. And in order for me to be a good citizen of that country, part of that is voting. Part of that is voting for the people who I think will best represent my interests in office, which is, for me, that's how I can exercise my rights, my duties as a citizen. That's one of the ways I can do it.
It's possible that none of the candidates running would best represent my interests, or I could find some other reason to object to voting simply because I don't think that the choices are representative. Or I could see that the cost of voting, spending time going to the polls would be too high of an opportunity cost, and I could do something more productive with my time.
So do you think that people should weigh up the opportunity costs of taking the time to go to the polls and compare that to the benefit they think they will get by voting for their favorite candidate?
I think that's a reasonable way to decide. And one way to kind of combat that, or to lower the opportunity cost to encourage more people to vote, is measures like absentee voting or some sort of online voting system that would make voting easier or less of a time cost.
Ellie?
I don't think the concern here should be about whether or not we have a duty to vote. If we are being paid to vote, that changes the nature of voting. And who's to say that there is no connection between being paid and the type of vote that we have? As you say, we don't know what the outcome is, and I think that's problematic.
Paying people to vote is corrupting or degrading, you think?
I think so.
Josh?
I think it definitely depends where the money's coming from. Because if it's coming from a casino, it's sort of like purchasing a vote because someone's more likely to vote in favor of the casino's preferences if they're being paid by that very entity. But if they were given just an incentive to vote in general, that may actually serve a better purpose because, as you said, often people don't vote at all. Like 50% in presidential elections, that's still pretty low.
Let's put aside the casino for the moment.
Okay.
And imagine a case of the government paying people a certain amount, a nominal amount, if they vote. What do you say to Ellie's worry that this somehow cheapens the vote? It's corrupting to give people the idea that the reason they should vote is for money.
I think it does cheapen the vote in a way. I think it's sort of our duty to serve our country in that particular way. So, in my opinion, I still don't think anyone should be paid to vote.
I would prefer to penalize, frankly, which sounds a bit harsh. But I think that mandatory voting, I think, is an important aspect of a civic role.
Oh, so you would be in favor?
I would.
You yourself of mandatory?
Yes. You know, if you are a citizen of a country and you are benefiting from public goods, I think part of being a good citizen is to show up And you're making choices not for yourself, but also for the future generations.
Right.
So I would be in favor of mandatory voting. I do understand that any hope of there being mandatory voting is pretty slim.
Mm-hmm.
So what alternative do I have? And it would seem to me that the only other alternative would be to incentivize people.
To pay them.
To pay them.
I don't vote in every election. I don't know why you'd want to bribe people to vote when they could vote costlessly, but don't because they have no interest, no knowledge, think it's all rigged and so on.
You don't think it would be a good thing to increase voter turnout?
No. Why would it be a good thing? One possibility is that you get less informed people voting more or less randomly, especially if you're going to pay someone who has no interest to vote. He'll just, toss a coin or something, or take the first person on the ballot, which is common, I think.
What about fining people if they don't vote? They do that in Australia, for example.
No, I think that'd be terrible. That'd be terrible because then their voting would really be irresponsible.
The most important factor in a country being successful is the quality of its institutions. And what makes countries wealthier and happier is high levels of civic engagement, institutions that function, and strong civic relationships. And if you turn those into markets, you actually undermine the efficiency of your economy in the long run. Anything that undermines that principle of everyone being equal and having an equal voice in the system ultimately undermines the system as a whole.
So Josh and Emily agree on this much, at least, that voting is a civic duty and that paying people to perform a duty somehow cheapens or degrades the meaning of that civic duty. Is there someone who disagrees with that idea? Ryan?
To what Emily said, that it's a civil obligation to vote, I don't think it is a civil obligation. And I think that it's just as much to not vote and say that the candidates are not expressing your interest. That is as much a protestation as voting itself.
Nicole?
Well, your silence means nothing to the state. Does the silence mean that you're apathetic? Does it mean that you're really passionate but nothing represents you? That's an opportunity for you to speak out. You're never going to change what the politicians look like if you stay silent.
Maybe on that merit, there could be a ballot option
Right.
to voice your reason for not choosing a candidate, to make it explicitly clear to the state why you have chosen not to pick a candidate.
I think
and
that's
why.
a great idea.
So you could have none of the above as an option on
Yes.
the ballot. Erica, you've even gone further. You can check none of the above and then write a short essay about why. Kevin?
I would argue that not voting is making the conscious decision to vote for the status quo. I have trouble articulating why I believe that it's a civil obligation. That being said, the democracy works better the more people who engage sincerely and seriously with the process itself. Whether that necessarily means we should jump to an obligation, I'm not totally sure about that. But it does work better if more people were engaged.
But you're not sure that there is a civic duty to vote.
I'm pretty sure there is. I just haven't come up with a good explanation for why.
What I was going to say is that I have absolutely no problem with using monetary incentives to vote. And the reason for this is that I do believe that in a sense it actually protects the whole voting process because it makes more people vote, and if more people vote, it's much harder to rig elections, or the effects of buying votes would be relatively smaller if the turnout is much larger.
I agree. I think that it's the casino is the one providing the incentives, creates a distortion of the process. However, if there was some sort of third party trying to get more Americans to vote, then I think that it makes sense to provide a monetary incentive for this process because it really makes the overall democratic system work better and more effectively.